of service. We gather
This hour, as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs, we light this beacon of hope, sign our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
In the words of Reverend Victoria Stafford, the central question for us is not what do we believe, but more, what do we believe in? To what larger love? To what people, principles, values, and dreams shall we be committed? To whom, to what are we accountable? These are weighty and worthy questions. And when the news of the world is very hard to hear, and there's almost nowhere where we can go to get away from it, we return here to this house of hope. Bombs explode and people shoot each other. So much of it appears senseless, though there are reasons enough for all of these wars. It's more a matter of it seeming unstoppable, of never ending. Even in our own neighborhoods and sometimes in our homes, sorrows abound, losses of loved ones and challenges that cannot be resolved but only met again and again. And we return to this house of hope. We return for solace to a community which values quiet reflection. We return to a place that anchors us in ways that strengthen our spirits. And we recommit to making a community in the midst of isolating and desolating forces that seem bent on tearing us apart and tearing us away from each other. Here we gain strength to meet the world again with all of its beauty and its destructiveness. Here we gather our gifts that we might again feel strong for the work of justice and healing that needs to be done again and again, like a moving tide, like the cycling seasons.
I'll be good. I'll be good.
Mindful that we are only but fully ourselves when we are meaningfully part of the larger circle. We turn and return in recommitment and love. We enter this time of shared silence and meditation. Let the agonies of the world in Tulsa, in North Carolina, in Syria, in Libya, in your town and in my town, let those agonies become light and bearable as we anchor ourselves in a loving community of compassion, acceptance, and support. friendly, and aesthetics-wise, it was definitely a step up for us. But I loved my neighborhood more. It was a mixed neighborhood, racially mixed, economically mixed, educationally mixed, age mixed. The houses were small and narrow, sitting very close to the sidewalk in the street. The college kids who rented the house next door, white kids with dreadlocks and lots of hemp symbols on their clothes. They were good. They were good kids. They kept rabbits on the front porch. I can live with that. They were nice to my kids. I just knocked the Buddha off. They were nice to my kids. They were good neighbors. Across the street in one of the big doubles, two older ladies lived, one above the other, and both named Mary. They lived in the neighborhood a long time. They raised their families there. And from their respective porches, the Marys kept the neighborhood watch. They knew who had lost a job. They knew who had started college. They knew who was neglecting their kids. Sometimes they threatened to call CPS. And they always called City Hall when the trash wasn't picked up. The Marys gave the news when I came home at the end of the day, calling it out across the narrow one-way street as I walked from the parking pad to my front stoop, where I could sit just for a few minutes next to the clematis vine and be neighborly. It, for me, was urban paradise. But snakes live in paradise too. Over the next 6 years, the college kids graduated and a series of drug dealers moved in and out and in. The Marys got older. They couldn't see as well, and they didn't feel as safe on their porches as they used to. Eventually, a shooting occurred, and I didn't feel safe anymore, especially for my children. And so we scrambled to sell, and then we scrambled to buy a brand new house, still in the city, but in a very different neighborhood, though it was only half a mile away. I could have catapulted my stuff to the new house faster than it took us to move it. This neighborhood I like to call the suburb in the city. It's a very wide street lined with mature trees, large houses set far back from the street, all with garages in the backyards. Some houses had front porches, but almost no one sat out on them. A lot of these houses had in-ground swimming pools, which I just thought was the lap of luxury. I do not have a swimming pool. Most of the time, most of us drove down the long driveways directly to the garages, opened them with our electronic garage door openers, entered our houses through back doors, and spoke to no one except our own families who were already inside of the houses. I don't know most of my neighbors, though I have lived there for 16 years. We do all of our living in our own backyards. All of my neighbors are white people. No one yells the news out from across the street. Now, this neighborhood is more beautiful than my old neighborhood, and it is safer than my old neighborhood, but it is not nearly as neighborly in all sorts of ways. And I learned this very unpleasantly one summer. I learned that my neighborhood has a written covenant. I didn't know that when I moved in. It wasn't part of the mortgage transaction. It wasn't part of the welcome wagon package. There was no welcome wagon. Once I became aware of the covenant, I learned I was expected to keep my sidewalks clear of snow in the winter. And that just made perfect sense to me, right? For safety and for courtesy. And I learned I was required to keep my grass at a certain height and no higher. Now, that was starting to feel a little bit precious to me. What about my dandelions? When were they going to become a problem? And I learned I was not permitted to park a boat or a recreational vehicle in my own driveway. Now that felt downright intrusive, even though I don't know either of those. Now, any of this, until I learned it when I found that my neighbor, or that all of us, had to keep a railing on our front porches. Now, my neighbor was doing a renovation, and she and her husband worked on this renovation themselves. It took a long time. She was very historically oriented, and she wanted to make sure that her house looked authentic. And so she looked at the old plans for the 1890s house, and there was no railing on the porch. So she took it off. And somebody, one of the neighbors, called the building inspector. And the building inspectors came with the covenant in their hand. The price my neighbor would pay for living in the suburb, in the city, was to have an historically inaccurate railing and to know that her neighbors called the building inspector on her. That was a far cry from the unspoken covenant of the Marys, watching that people were safe and that people were connected. As Unitarian Universalists, at some level we all know ours is a covenantal religion. We know we don't have to declare a creed, a common belief, in order to be a member of this congregation or any of our congregations. We know that a covenant is what sets us apart from the Catholics or the Episcopals or the Lutherans, for example. Yet the challenge comes when we don't realize we are operating within a covenant, when we don't know what the parameters are, when we don't know specifically what the covenant demands of us. In my first neighborhood, we were living in covenant, but in unspoken agreement that we would watch out for each other, that we would care for the health of the street, that we would acknowledge each other as fellow travelers in our little slice of the universe. And then the people changed. Some moved away. Some got old. People moved in who didn't have the same sense of how a neighborhood could be neighborly. No one took up that most valuable work of keeping the boundaries and the commitments in place. Not me. Does that sound familiar? In my current neighborhood, the covenant is more like a set of rules wielded by self-proclaimed neighborhood caretakers in order to keep our property values up. Individually, we all benefit if individually we keep our lawns cut to a certain height. That is not a covenant in which I'm very interested. That's a covenant that asks nothing of me in regard to watching out for each other, or keeping the street healthy, or acknowledging my fellow travelers on our journey of living. What happens when we lose track of why a covenant is worth making and maintaining? As I reminded you last week and again today, the central question for us Unitarian Universalists is not what do we believe, but more, what do we believe in? To what larger love? To what people, principles, values, and dreams shall we be committed? To whom, to what are we accountable? And so as we consider this idea of covenant, let us consider these questions. As individuals and friends of this congregation, to what are we asked to commit? How do we keep our commitment vital and creative? How do we renew it as people come and go, as circumstances, as they always do, change? This is our challenge as members of a church. So now the part of me that's a college professor kicks in, and I have a little conversation about covenants from the past. So one of the most significant ones, I think, is the one in Genesis chapter 9, right, between Noah and the God of the early Hebrews understanding. And I find it really interesting because despite its position in a text that seems to demand a set of shared beliefs, the words here are really about behavior and promises. So that God says, I establish my covenant with you, promising Noah and his family that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And to seal the deal, God says, I've set my rainbow in the clouds and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. There's the promise, to not destroy the world by flood ever again. And the rainbow is there as a reminder. And it's God who does the remembering. Now, do you know what human behavior was expected in return for this promise? It is not, as you might think, worship of the all-powerful and clearly destructive and terrifying God. That's not what he asked for. And it is not, another fair guess, belief that God is God, or God is the only God. What are the humans to promise in return for this agreement, in this covenant with God, that the earth shall never again be destroyed by flood? The asked for covenant, the required commitment is that humans not kill each other anymore. That's right. No more taking of human life. The God asks humans to be more neighborly, more caring of each other. In verses 5 and 6 of chapter 9, my translation says it this way: whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed, for in his own image God made humankind. Now, if you're all familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, you might remember there's a whole lot of human blood shedding that follows that passage. That's in the first book, Genesis. And though Noah and his family seem not to be the offenders, they kept their promise. But then all those fruitfully multiplied people came along, and they didn't seem to buy into the covenant that preceded them, right? I think we all know where the rest of the world is with that covenant also, right? So closer to our own time and history, as Unitarian Universalists, is the Puritan covenant of 1629. And it is very beautiful and simple. We covenant with the Lord and one another, and do bind ourselves in the presence of God to walk together in all his ways, according as he is pleased to reveal himself unto us in his blessed word of truth. That's it. And I think it's amazing for what it can offer us today, as theologically diverse as we are. They promise to covenant not only with God, but with each other, to bind themselves one to another. They will walk together, and they humbly make clear that they're doing their best together to discern what the God, as they understand it, wants of them. They're doing the best they can. Well, just 7 short years later, in 1636, that covenant is not good anymore, and they have to try for a new one. And the simplicity doesn't work anymore. That lovely short covenant is embedded in one 12 times longer. 12 times with lots of prescriptions on behavior. And it starts with an admission of failure. Having found by sad experience how dangerous it is to sit loose to the covenant we make with our God, and how apt we are to wander to bypass, even to the loosening of our first aims in entering into church fellowship. These ancestors of ours are struggling and still trying to be in right relationship, still trying to walk together as best they can. But as the covenant tells us, the folks have been gossiping and provoking and offending both each other and their God. And they have been fighting in the church, and they have been fighting with other churches, and they have been questioning the primacy of Jesus. Very big no-no. Why is this happening? I'm sure they cried out as they made these new covenants. Well, lots of new people have been arriving with their own ideas about God and belief, about church polity and civil government, about how to treat the people who were there before the pilgrims arrived. And many of these folks had clearly forgotten that much earlier covenant between Noah and God, as there was a lot of bloodshed in early America. The covenants of Puritan churches, which became Congregational churches, which became Unitarian and Universalist and Unitarian Universalist churches, these covenants have gone through many, many revisions over the last 370 years. It is a struggle, yes it is, to remain in covenant. Even though we pride ourselves on being a non-creedal people, we sometimes find it very hard to sit with folks whose beliefs about the holy seem less rational or less mystical than our own, less humanist or less theist than our own, less inclusive or less compassionate than our own. It can be hard to sit with folks when you disagree about the priority of social justice initiatives or the form RE should take, or if the partnership, yet another covenant, should continue and what it should look like. We make jokes in our culture that if you want to keep peace at family holiday gatherings, avoid all discussions of religion and politics. Well, what else do we have to talk about? If we're to be in covenant, if we're to walk together, looking out for each other and doing the best we can as a church, what else is there? Now we have the 7 principles, right, that bind us as a denomination. And a lot of us think of that as a set of beliefs sometimes. But it's most definitely a covenant. However, Reverend Sue Phillips challenges the 7 principles as a covenant. She writes, as Unitarian Universalist congregations, we covenant to affirm and promote the principles. Affirming and promoting shared values is important, but it puts tepid commitment at our collective center, asking virtually nothing of us, and offers virtually nothing. It is not covenanting, it is parallel play, as if we're in kindergarten. She presents us with quite a challenge. Reverend Phillips makes a good point. How do you, each of you here, for example, in our little neighborhood, how do you affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person? Or show justice and compassion to each other? Or accept one another and encourage your spiritual growth? And all the rest of them. What does that look like in practice for you? How do you remind yourselves to walk together and to bind yourselves to one another and encourage each other to do your best? What does that walk look like for you? And how do you make this covenant clear to a newcomer, right? To all who come through these doors and all who stay, even in the midst of loss and turmoil, even when ministers and congregants leave, even when everything is changing. What shape does your guidance to the covenant take? Through what pain? Through what seeking? Through what disappointment do you say yes? To what life? To what truth? To what love do you continue to say yes? As we go forward today, I ask you to consider these questions. To what do you say yes? Now I can say that since I arrived at this church, I have been greeted by kindliness, friendliness, and patience. And so by your actions, I feel what a good people you are. And so when I ask you to consider these questions, it's not out of fault finding, but it's to look deeply inside to see how the things that matter most to us actually are manifested in the reality that other people can observe and participate in. Talk with those you love about the great yes of your life. And bring your answers back to church in explicit and open ways. It seems to me that it's only with conscious intention and effort of deliberate and recognizable inclusion, acceptance, and compassion that we build a new way, bound to each other and walking the path together, doing the best we can to be neighborly with each other in a world that needs our love and our work and our commitment. As members of this church, we have hitched our wagons to each other's. We are journeying together, though the journey, as all journeys, is hard. But no journey leads to a dead end. We can learn and redirect. We can always recalculate. We can be each other's Siri. Let us promise this to each other today and every day, as you remember, you are loved, you are worthy, you are welcome, and you are needed. May you feel it so.
Yes, put your songbooks down and take a hand of someone next to you. Let no person go without their hand untaken. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. So go in peace.
Go in one piece.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.